For those of you who don't know who I am, my name is Cassandra Farrell. I am the senior map archivist at the Library of Virginia in Richmond, Virginia, the State Library and Archives for the Commonwealth. And today I'm presenting Of Horror to Hell, Can Come a Devil More Damned Than Evil to Top Dunmore, a spatial history of Lord Dunmore's proclamation. This is a part of a series of events that the Library of Virginia has been hosting to celebrate the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. As you may or may not know, tomorrow, November 7th, is the 250th anniversary of Lord Dunmore's proclamation, which he compiled while sitting on board the ship the William in the Norfolk Harbor. And it his proclamation was not well received by the Patriots in 1775. I can tell you that. Now, as for those enslaved Virginians, there are quite a few of them who took him up on his offer. So anyway, let's get started. This is the first time that I have given this presentation, and so bear with me. I might have to work through a few areas. There's some areas where I'm still fleshing out ideas and thinking about them, but please keep that in mind. But why am I doing this? Well, I thought it would be cool to explore the spatial history of Dunmore's proclamation in November and December 1775 and beyond, believe it or not. And I thought it would be cool to see where it was published and discussed and mentioned in newspapers, and then to search for imprints, books, pamphlets, plays that discuss the proclamation, as well as any letters um, between Americans, Virginians and Americans in late 1775 that discussed his proclamation. And then I wanted to then I wanted to try to map it. And so I did that using ArcGIS Pro. And I tried to gauge the comments about the proclamation too. And I haven't quite figured out how to map that yet, but I'm working on it. And at some point, I want to create a timeline of the flow of events. I can certainly provide everyone with dates for the publications, but I haven't as of yet created a timeline to show everything. And I'm going to be working on that. But here you see on the screen are locations in British North America where the proclamation was discussed, referenced, or published. And there are variations. Some newspapers published it, others just discussed it, and then others just mentioned it in articles from Virginia or from other newspapers. So these are the sources that I consulted. I looked at Founders Online National Archives. That is something everyone on this Zoom call can access. So if you go to Google or to Bing or whatever your favorite browser is, you just type in Founders Online National Archives, and that database should pop up. I also used Redex Newspapers, which is a subscription database, American Historical Imprints, Caribbean Newspapers Online. I checked Burney's Index to British Newspapers, the database American Periodicals. I looked at microfilm copies of Southern newspapers, the Colonial American Database, courtesy Adam Matthews, and the America History 1943 to 1945 database, courtesy Adam Matthews as well. I picked these databases because it allows you to search multiple sources in one database, and then you can also do search for Dunmore and Dunmore's proclamation, and the OCR is really good in most of these databases. The library just subscribes that the databases you can access remotely from the Library of Virginia include American periodicals, and you have Virginia Chronicle. I didn't use Virginia Chronicle because it focuses just on Virginia newspapers, and that's why I focused on Redex newspapers because it covered all colonial newspapers that it's in their online database. And because I'm a graduate student at George Mason University, I was able to access the Adam Matthew databases. And I hope at some point in the library's future we will have an opportunity to subscribe to Colonial America database. It's awesome. So I just wanted to spend a few minutes briefly recounting, and I will try to make this brief, but briefly recounting events in Virginia in 1775 and 1776, early 76, and I mean really early 76. Um, a lot has been written about this time period, and if you want to find more about what was going on, there are several books and articles that you can access. For example, Virginia Encyclopedia provides some pretty nifty articles about Dunmore's proclamation, the conventions meeting in Virginia. Those of you who have been participating in our series are familiar with Andrew Lawler's book, Frenzy. He gave a book talk about A Perfect Frenzy, which is about Lord Dunmore, the gentleman we're going to be focusing on today. And of course, numerous articles have been published about the Dunmore's Proclamation and of course about Virginia in 1775 and 1776. So so if we begin in 1774, Lord Dunmore has just returned from the West, and he has just acquired a significant amount of land, which we call Kentucky today, for Virginia. And at that time, Kentucky became a territory of Virginia. So he's very popular. He's in December of 74, but by the spring of 1775, his fortunes have changed significantly. By that point, you have serious events occurring in New England. In March of 75, Patrick Henry is calling for Virginians to create a militia that is outside of British control, British purview. And in April of 1775, Lord Dunmore seizes the colony's gunpowder supply from the magazine in Williamsburg. And for those of you who are familiar with Colonial Williamsburg and where the magazine is located, for those of you who are not, just think about in Colonial Williamsburg, there is a main street called Duke of Gloucester Street. And across from the courthouse, there is the Colonial Magazine, which is like an octagonal structure. Well, it's in that structure that the colony's gunpowder supply was kept. Well, he had it seized and had it removed to a ship that was anchored off of Yorktown in the York River. So he eventually has to flee Williamsburg, the governor's palace in Williamsburg, where he resides, and he is forced to board the Fowey, Fowey. It could be the Fooey. I'm not quite sure. I say Fowey, but it could be Fooey or Fowey. So anyway, he is forced to flee, and as he and as he's on board the Fowey, which is off of the coast of Yorktown, they 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 learn of attempts of some enslaved Virginians trying to join him at his plantation. And also, um, what is becoming clear is that he is thinking about how he can encourage others to join him in his cause against the Patriots, because by this point, his control in Virginia is just disintegrating. He has to leave Williamsburg, which is the capital. He is on board the ship the Fowey, but he hinted at what his thoughts were about what he might do if the Patriots did attack him or any of his staff. Someone recorded a conversation in which he said that if any injury or insult was offered himself or either of them, meaning his staff, he would declare freedom to the slaves and reduce the city of Williamsburg to ashes. This is recorded from a conversation that he had with someone in Williamsburg in April 1775. Apparently, it's an idea he had been thinking about for a while and eventually percolates and eventually culminates in his proclamation later on. Well, they are forced to flee Yorktown because if you've been to Yorktown, you can see the York River and the bluffs are there. Well, their location was easy. Um, it was easy for the Patriots to monitor what the foe and the other ships in the York River were doing. So they sailed down to Norfolk, to the Norfolk Harbor, Hampton Roads area. And from there, he continues to have enslaved Virginians join him. He There are actually enslaved Americans who travel down to join him as well. There are skirmishes between he and the Patriots, and he finds that he needs to build an army, build a bigger army than what he has. And so it's on November 7th, 1775, that he issued his proclamation. He wrote it up on board the HMS William. And he had a printing press on board that he had, I can't say the word borrowed, we'll say acquired in quotation, air quotations, from the Norfolk printer, Mr. Holt, and he was using his printing press to print the proclamation. He doesn't publish it, though, until after the skirmish at Kemp's Landing in November 14th, 1775. And for those of you who are looking at the map on the screen, you just have to scroll down to Norfolk, and then just below that, and just slightly to the east, is Kempsville Landing. Kempsville Landing. And it's after their success here. He had over 300 Black Virginians fighting with him. And of course, British troops, the 14th Regiment of Foot, had sailed up from St. Augustine earlier that year to join Lord Dunmore in Norfolk. So, of course, he issues his proclamation and requests that the British Navy distribute the proclamation throughout the Chesapeake Bay, to ports and stops throughout the Chesapeake Bay, to get out the word that he's seeking and asking Virginians to join him. And the Patriots do control the flow of information. So the only way that Dunmore can get the word out is by sea. The Patriots, the Continental Congress, had established a post office routes in the spring of 1775. And so if Dunsmore wanted to communicate with anybody in the British Army, or if he wanted to relay any information, it had to be done by the water. So in his proclamation, he the phrase that really disturbed the Patriots and the Continental Congress and the American cause was he offered freedom to all indentured servants, Black Americans, and others who were willing to bear arms to defend the British troops. And he asked them and other loyalists to join his standard. He established a standard, and also requested that people take a loyalty oath. And a number of people in Princess Anne County, which is now Virginia Beach, Virginia, and in Norfolk County, which is now Chesapeake, Virginia, did take the oath. So anyway, after the proclamation is issued, um, more enslaved Virginians join him. Um, Enslaved Americans join him. Some living in present-day West Virginia, others up even in New England. So they traveled down at great cost to themselves to join him. But and as you know, the first real battle of in Virginia of the American Revolution occurred at the Battle of Great Bridge on December 9th, 1775. And the British and Lord Dunmore and his forces lose. And the Lord Dunmore um, decide that they can't stay in Norfolk. It's the topography doesn't favor them staying there. It's easy. Well, it's a lowland. It's not a good place to stay long term. So they end up boarding the ships um, in the river and in the harbor and staying on those instead. And of course, um, the Patriots were sniping at the boats in the harbor, and Lord Dunmore on January 1st ordered members of the Ethiopian Regiment and the 14th Regiment of Foot to remove the sniper posts and to burn them out. Well, that evolves into a major fire, which Patriots found out, or they conducted they researched what happened in Norfolk on January 1st and determined that it was the Patriots who were really responsible for the fire of Norfolk and were responsible for 96% of the buildings being destroyed. However, Lord Dunmore was blamed for the burning of Norfolk, not only by the Patriots, but also by the British. And it wasn't until much later that the report that the Patriots compiled about Norfolk was made known. But it was long after the American Revolution ended and long after Lord Dunmore died. So obviously, it sets back Norfolk's development for years. Eventually, Lord Dunmore is forced to flee to Gwynn's Island, and eventually, he and the Ethiopian regiment are forced to sail to New York and join the British Army there. So, what are some of the ripple effects of Dunmore's proclamation? Washington reverses his position regarding free black men serving in the military. He was opposed to it after Lord Dunmore's proclamation. He allows it. And historians have, as of now, have come to determine that about 20,000 Black Americans fight for the British during the American Revolutionary War. And after the war ends, about 10,000 were forced to flee New York, where they risked being re-enslaved by their slave owners in the South. And a number of them went to Nova Scotia, West Indies, Sierra Leone. So a number of Black Americans who fought during the American Revolution were forced to flee and live other places to remain free. So what about the proclamation in newspapers and in imprints? And this is an illustration of an 18th century printing shop. So here's a timeline of the publication of the proclamation in newspapers. And you'll notice that the first paper to break the news was the Williamsburg-based Virginia Gazettes. There were three Virginia Gazettes operating in Williamsburg. And they break the news. They actually publish Lord Dunmore's proclamation, and they also provide commentary before it and after it. And from what we could gather, the commentary was probably written by John Page, although it's his involvement is unanimous. There's no author written or printed that I as being the author of some of those longer articles that discuss the proclamation and their issues with it. In fact, one of the articles that preceded the publication of the proclamation included the phrase on the opening slide for this presentation. So, um, they, of course, the editors and the Patriots, members of the Virginia Convention, members of the Virginia Public Safety, are opposed to his proclamation. And in this article that's about 2 columns in length, they give reasons why people should not join Dunmore, and they specifically address Virginia's enslaved population, um, encouraging them to think about the difficulties of escaping, because if you escape and are caught, you risk imprisonment, you risk being physically hurt, you also risk being sent to the iron mines of Virginia. And the article continued by asking Black Virginians to consider their fate if the English win the war. that they need to consider that the British may only use them to fight for them and may offer them um, for sale in the West Indies. And he encouraged them to consider it lest they ruin themselves, which is a which is interesting. And it also makes you wonder how many of the because this would have been read aloud in coffee shops and in taverns, I'm sure the message was quickly forwarded to Virginia's enslaved population and also to other enslaved populations throughout British North America. So the Purdy the John Pinckney Pinkney publishes it, the proclamation, on November 23rd. Purdy publishes it in his issue of the Virginia Gazette on November 24th, and then Lord Dunmore publishes a version, the proclamation, in his version of the Virginia Gazette from aboard his ship the William on November 25th. So for those 3 days in Virginia, in those three issues of the Gazettes, his proclamation is published, and the news is spread out. And of course, the British ships are leaving copies throughout the Chesapeake Bay area. But unlike the papers and news in Williamsburg, Lord Dunmore's proclamation instead publishes letters that were meant for George Washington for people to read, gives updates about the Continental Congress, and then discusses the skirmish at Kempsville Landing. Well, immediately, you'll notice on the screen that the next colony to publish the news about it is Pennsylvania. It's the Pennsylvania newspapers and the Pennsylvania journals that pick up on it very quickly. And that makes sense considering that the Continental Congress was meeting in Philadelphia. So it does make sense that if you follow, here, I'm going to bring up the next page here. If you follow the trail, you'll find that Virginia, first published in Virginia, and then it moves up the coast, up to Philadelphia, up to New York, making its way into New England in December and in early January, and even appearing in the Charleston newspaper in January of 1776. Maryland banned mail from Virginia, so you do not see the proclamation published in the Maryland Gazettes. I checked the Southern Gazettes, the papers for North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, and none of them published the proclamation either. And I only found one description or even one reference to it, and that is in an article titled Savannah in Georgia that was published in the South Carolina paper in January 1776. So it appears that Maryland and the other southern colonies did their best to cap the news of the proclamation being published in their areas, which, considering their populations, that makes sense. But it is being discussed in Pennsylvania. It is being discussed in Norfolk. It is being discussed in New England. And I even found one paper that mentioned it in England in 1776. So they're including, oftentimes the proclamation is discussed along with Lord Dunmore recruiting his army. There were reports of 2,000 black soldiers joining him. And the newspapers in December, especially those in Pennsylvania, emphasized the fact that the black regiments were wearing uniforms with the phrase "Liberty to Slaves" inscribed on their breasts, and that the Virginia waterways were being monitored by the Patriots to discourage any enslaved Virginians from joining him. So, and the one issue of the Maryland Gazette that even slightly references it or mentions it was published in December 1775. And basically, it's a reprint of an article published in Williamsburg on December 2nd, which basically describes he's issued a proclamation He's raised an army of 2,000 soldiers. They wear on their breast a phrase, "Liberty to slaves." Virginia's waterways are being watched, etc., etc. And so you see this information being repeated up um, the North American coastline. So, excuse me. What's really interesting is that a series of letters from loyalists regarding Lord Dunmore and their letters to, family members in England and in Glasgow were captured and republished in the Virginia Gazette and also in the Pennsylvania papers, which makes for very interesting reading and also shows how much they supported Lord Dunmore. But as a loyalist, I certainly wouldn't want that published in any Patriot newspaper in 1775 and 1776. No way. Well, anyway, this screen shows the distribution of the newspapers and their newspaper titles. And if you were to click on the balloons in ArcGIS Pro, it would then list the number of newspapers in that particular city and their titles and indicate just how many um, newspapers were referenced. And of course, it is small, and I have been working on getting the titles to show up better, but this does show the distribution and the newspapers in which um, the proclamation is certainly discussed. So it's known and published and distributed up and down the North American seaboard in November and December in early 1776. And and here is a better representation of the article titles um, that are showing up in certain American cities. There are issues being published, Boston, um, Hartford, Connecticut, of course, New York and Philadelphia, and even in Annapolis. So what about in imprints? And imprints I'm using loosely for books published in the 18th century, pamphlets, even plays. And here's a list of books and plays and pleas that were published in 1776 that mention or discuss Lord Dunmore's proclamation. A few of them are histories, and if you check the histories, oftentimes you'll find Dunmore's War discussed in what's going on in 1775. The Journals of the Congress of 1776 certainly discuss. You find where the members of the Continental Congress are discussing it. Um, the Virginia Convention records are published in 1776 too, by Purdy, the printer Purdy of Williamsburg, and distributed. So you have another publication in which Lord Dunmore's proclamation um, is discussed. And in fact, the that issue includes the declaration that the Virginia Convention compiled in response to Lord Dunmore's proclamation. And that declaration was republished not only in the Virginia Gazettes, but also in the Pennsylvania papers too. And then here is an additional list. What I find ironic is that in A Church History of New England by Isaac Backus, there's a footnote at the bottom of page 330 discusses Lord Dunmore and blaming him for the burning of the town of Norfolk and what he was doing in December 1775 and January 1776. And what I also found is his proclamation and the formation of the Ethiopian Regiment is something that William Joseph T. Wilson discusses in his book, The Black Phalanx. A history of the Negro soldiers of the United States in the wars of 1775 to 1812 and 1861 to 1865. The good news is all of these titles should be available for Library of Virginia researchers to access through our database, Sabine's Americana, and you can also check the database American Periodicals too. So all of these titles are books that you can access through both of those databases. What I wanted to focus on um, is A, the play, The Fall of British Tyranny or American Liberty, that was compiled by John Leacock of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. He compiled this and published it 2 months after Mr. Paine's book, pamphlet Common Sense, was published. So Paine's Common Sense was published in January 76. Ergo, John Leacock's The Fall of British Tyranny was published probably in March or April of 1776. It is a satirical play, heavily influenced by Common Sense, and it uses tragic comedy, as it says in the title, to satirize British rule and to advocate for American independence. It was a success, and although the theaters in Philadelphia had been closed by the Continental Congress, it is very likely that the play was read aloud to booksellers and critics, members of the literati, both professional and amateur, um, probably discussed in public, and it is known for being the first American Chronicle play. It consists of 5 acts, 26 scenes, and you'll find Lord Dunmore, also known as Lord Kidnapper, in this play. Notice the play on the trope Lord Kidnapper. And instead of considering him as someone who is in freeing slaves and bettering the lives of human beings, he's instead considered Lord Kidnapper. Because in their minds, he violated social protocol, he violated Virginia's cultural structure, social structure, by offering freedom to enslaved Virginians if they joined him, and also to indentured servants. And so obviously consider him or call him Lord Kidnapper. So you'll find him discussed in Act 4. Act 4, Scene 1 opens with Lord Kidnapper on board of his man of war. And it includes dialogue between he and caricatures of enslaved Virginians who had joined him. The play was produced in Harvard and likely at Valley Forge in 1778. So, according to the references I read, it was wildly popular to Americans. The other publication, oh, and this was published in Philadelphia. It was also published in Boston and in Providence, Rhode Island. It was not published in the American South, again, which makes sense. Here is the other item I wanted to take some time to look at, and that is the Plea of the Colonies, which was compiled by Hugh Williams. And it's a pamphlet that was published in London in 1776. Williams had actually witnessed the Boston Tea Party and had traveled to England and was actually interviewed by the Privy Council there as an eyewitness to the Boston Tea Party. And he compiled this plea while he was there, and it's an answer to accusations made by Lord Mansfield. And in the pamphlet, he defends the colony's grievances against British authority, and it is from the American perspective, and it demonstrates well the growing conflict with Great Britain. Published, as I said, in London in 1776 and again in 1777. He mentions directly Lord Dunmore on page 26 of the pamphlet, and it describes that what Lord Dunmore did in Williamsburg or in from Norfolk as an affront, um, as an affront to Virginians and to all Americans. And he was appalled that the British didn't take more steps to protect their white subjects from an insurrection, because they were very concerned that with Lord Dunmore's proclamation being issued, that that could very well happen. And so if you would like to read it, you can check pages 26 and 27. I'm reticent to read some of the sentences on page 27 without having a disclaimer. Um, but yeah, if you would like to read more, you can definitely check out what he has to say there. But he makes it very clear um, that Lord Dunmore's proclamation is certainly one of many events that is alienating the colonists from England, adding to their indignities, and he basically states that he thinks that the British are going to lose the colonists if they don't make changes. And this was published in London and in Philadelphia and was certainly distributed throughout the colonies. Williams was actually trained as a minister, and then he went to medical school. And then later on in his life, he represented North Carolina in the United States House of Representatives. And after that, he moved to Philadelphia and died there in 1819. Okay, so here's a distribution. As you can see, here's a spatial visual distribution of the imprints, the pamphlets, the books, etc. in North America, and also in Great Britain. Publications in some of the books were published in Scotland, in London, and of course in Boston, Philadelphia. Of course, one of the ones that was published in Williamsburg was the Proceedings of the Convention of the Delegates, the Fourth Convention in 1776. Okay, so we're up, it's 12:40, so let me get to the last section. Letters from the founders online that discuss Lord Dunmore's proclamation. So I had the opportunity to go into Founders Online and search which letters included or mentioned Lord Dunmore's proclamation. And here is the list. It should be in date order. Um, and you'll notice, again, a lot of them are going to George Washington. And what I did and what I mapped in the map that follows the slide is I mapped where the letters were written. I did not think until this morning about mapping where they were read, and so I apologize for that. So the map that I'm going to bring up does show where they were written. But you'll see, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, Washington corresponding with Reed, Washington corresponding with his brother Lund Washington. And ironically, it's not until the December 2nd letter to John Hancock to George Washington that I actually found um, the proclamation being discussed. And in the earlier letters, there were certainly concerns written about him, about Lord Dunmore actually calling enslaved Virginians to his aid. Um, but you don't see any real discussions about the proclamation until December. So that tells me that news of the proclamation didn't reach Philadelphia until December 1775. And if you look at the letters, they provide context to the newspapers and some of the imprints that are published in 1776. And of course, the Continental Congress has issues with it. Um, One letter was sent by folks who lived in Northampton County, Virginia. They wanted to make known to the Continental Congress that Lord Dunmore had erected a standard in Norfolk and proclaimed martial law and invited um, Black Virginians to join them and offer him freedom. And they sent it by way of the Eastern Shore because they thought it would reach Philadelphia faster by way of the Eastern Shore instead of the Western Shore of Virginia. And then, of course, in the December 2nd and December 3rd article letters, um, they discuss the publication of it. They just they ponder the effects that it will have upon indentured servants and any enslaved on their properties, and their concerns about him enacting martial law in Virginia and how Virginians will respond to that and respond to Lord Dunmore um, raising the standard. So it is interesting. George Washington comments in one of the letters that the only way to um, to defeat Dunmore is um, basically by war. That is the only way he can think of that will free the colony from the effects of as he describes, Lord Dunmore's resentments and villainies. So the last item in which in Founders Online in which I found direct reference to the proclamation is in correspondence um, between Benjamin Franklin and Lafayette. They were working on publishing a list of prints to illustrate British atrocities. And in that letter, which was written in May 1779 in Paris, France, they discussed that in this book, um, which was, I think, to be a history book of the American Revolution, that, indeed discusses British crimes according to the American view. And two of the illustrations they thought that should be included in the book is the burning of Norfolk. Of course, in their minds, that was done by Lord Dunmore. And also an illustration of Lord Dunmore hiring um, Black Americans to murder their masters' families, showing blacks armed with guns and hangers and masters and sons on the ground dead. And so they wanted to use these illustrations to show just how damaging Lord Dunmore's proclamation was um, to them and to their livelihood and to their way of life. So I hope um, this presentation has helped explain and show the spatial history of Lord Dunmore's proclamation. As you can see from the maps that I've shown, it um, went beyond Virginia, certainly went beyond Williamsburg and Richmond, and was certainly being discussed in British North America and also in London and even in Paris. I did find in London that there was a volume published, well, volumes published of important articles and important events that occurred in the American Revolution. And they started publishing that series in 1776. So, um, thank you for attending today during your lunch hour. Thank you for joining us. If you have any questions, please post them in the chat. I will do my best to answer them or direct you to the source that can answer them. And yeah, that's Lord Dunmore and the spatial history of his proclamation.
Thanks so much, Cassandra. And we've had some great feedback in the chat and a lot of great resource sharing as well.
Okay,
We have a couple of questions from the chat too.
sure.
How did word get out to the enslaved? Word of mouth?
That's the good question. And you see comments from people in their letters of how they have an unusual network of correspondence. Um, most likely by word of mouth because the enslaved are there. They're in the taverns, they're in the coffee houses, they're hearing what's going on, and they have a wonderful network of communication. So yes, I would say that's probably it.
Thank you. Why did Maryland ban news from Virginia?
because they didn't, I'm suspecting that they didn't want word of the proclamation to get out because they had, I mean, there were a number of plantation owners who enslaved people on their plantation. So I'm assuming that's the educational assumption I can make. It's because they didn't want word to get out. Someone might want to look into that a little bit further. I know that there are histories of Maryland. You might want to check some of those to see if there's a discussion about that.
Great. All right. And we have another question. So over the somebody who submitted a question says, over the years, I've dabbled with a few platforms for visualizing spatial history. I always
Hmm.
resort to story maps because it's the platform I know best. Are you
Hmm.
leaning towards a particular app or platform to create a spatialized platform? I've seen some nifty apps, but they tend to require knowledge of coding, which I don't have much patience for.
Understood. And I will tell you, at George Mason, I did not have to take a foreign language requirement because I'm focusing on spatial history because they digital humanities, and when you're working with like ArcGIS Pro and QGIS, it is another language. Totally hear you, but you can learn it. Absolutely, you can learn it. And we are hoping to have, I would like to host a session. I need to talk to the education outreach team more about possibly holding a Zoom session to show folks how to use QGIS. You have to you have to download that program onto your computers before that because I cannot help you with that. But we could do that to show folks how to use QGIS. ArcGIS Pro is by Esri and you have to pay to use it. I like Story Maps JS. In fact, I've been contemplating what I could use to create a timeline for this. And Story Maps JS is easy to use, as you know. And they also have a timeline feature that you can use. Another platform that I like to use is Esri Story Maps, separate from Story Maps JS. And I don't have a particular one I like to use. I think it's based upon what the topic is about and what are we trying to show. I that's my answer to that. So what is the purpose of our project will determine which platform we use. And I hope that makes sense. I hope I answered your question.
Great. Thank you. No, that's great.
Mhm.
All right, we just have a few more questions that we
Sure.
have a little bit of time for. Was military rule enforced in Virginia? Did he have the military to back it up?
Dunmore, he had the British fleet and he had the regiment of foot and he had the black soldiers who had joined him, but basically the only area that you could consider under loyalist control was Norfolk and Princess Anne. And even then, Patriots were in that area too. And no, he really did not control the area. The Committee of Safety um, and the Committee of Safeties were really in control and not Lord Dunmore's government. I would encourage you to read some histories of the American Revolution. McDonald has published a good book on Virginians during the American Revolution. That'll give you some insight as to who was really in control. Um, I recommend it. It's a good book, and there are others you can check out too.
Great. Did Dunmore's proclamation either chill other royal governors from making similar proclamations or inspire other royal governors to make similar proclamations?
That's a good question. So many of the royal governors were forced to flee, and his is the only one that I'm aware of.
Hmm,
So that doesn't mean that there aren't others. It's the only one I've heard discussed.
interesting.
But that, I mean, please check that out. That's a good question.
All right. You mentioned that 10,000 of the black soldiers had to flee the US after the war. What happened to the other 10,000 soldiers?
I don't know. How many people you have to consider how many of them were free blacks when they joined, how many of them were enslaved and left. Um, I think a lot of them integrated into American cities, particularly up north, and lived their lives in cities like Boston and Philadelphia and in New York City. And he became craftsmen and mechanics and such in those areas. And there are reasons why they had to flee. I mean, because you had southern planters actually hiring individuals to capture their slaves and bring them back to work on the plantations. That's scary to think about, but that was going on.
All right, thank you. We have one last question.
Sure.
Um, how can we have this entire briefing without mentioning that the proclamations offered did not apply to those held by Tories?
Thank you. Thank you for mentioning that. Thank you for coming, and please check our events calendar for future Zoom talks and future events that we'll be hosting at the Library of Virginia.